Hey guys, and welcome back to Bedtime Crime, my true crime channel here on YouTube. And today we are going to do yet another case about unsolved crimes. That's the series that we're in right now. And I believe this is actually the last one for the series, which is kind of bittersweet. I've actually really enjoyed researching these unsolved cases, but I'm excited to start a new series and excited to see what you guys think of the new series. So I decided that from now on, instead of announcing the series prematurely, I think I'm just going to upload a video, the first video of the series, and then I'm going to describe what the new series is going to be in that video. So look forward to that. And today's case is not as well known as I personally think it should be. It's crazy. The entire case is just absolutely insane, and I didn't really hear much about it ever. I don't think I had actually heard of it until I went to go research for this case, and just seeing how everything played out and what happened and all the twists and turns that it took is just absolutely crazy. So I hope you guys enjoy me talking about this case today. And yeah, it's still an unsolved case, so as always, prepare for slight disappointment, because it's always disappointing to see that these cases aren't solved after so many years. And once again, this case does take place in the 90s, so it has been, I think, over 30 years now. So we're always holding out hope for justice, but you just never know with these unsolved cases, especially if they turn cold. So with all of that being said, please subscribe to my channel if you are not already. It really helps me out a lot. And like this video if you end up liking me talking about this case. And let's just jump into it. So we're gonna go back all the way to the year 1991, and in this year, life seemed pretty normal for the four young girls that we are going to be discussing today. There was Jennifer Harbison, who was 17, and she was enjoying her senior year, and she was running track, and she loved running track. And her parents actually had recently bought her a car, which she was super excited about, with the condition that she would get a job and consistently make payments on the car. That was kind of their compromise for buying her the car, was that she would have to make the payments. Now, she also had a younger sister. Her younger sister was named Sarah Harbison, and she was 15 at this time and enjoying trying out some new clubs, you know, going through her freshman year. She tried out volleyball, basketball, just kind of seeing what called to her. And they both attended Lanier High School, and that was on Peyton Gin Road in Austin, Texas. And everything that I'm going to be talking about today does take place in Austin, Texas, which is why it's sometimes referred to as the Austin Yogurt Shop Murders, because it took place in Austin. Their mother, Sarah and Jennifer's mother, Barbara Ayers Wilson, was with them every step of the way. She always supported everything they did and was committed to helping and spending as much time as she could with her daughters. And they actually all were originally living in Texarkana, which was a town in Bowie County, Texas. But when Barbara and Jennifer and Sarah's father got divorced, they decided to move to Austin for a fresh start. Before Lanier High School, they actually transferred originally from a private Catholic school. The move actually really helps them, and they really enjoyed living in Austin and going to Lanier High School. Moving on to the third girl, her name is Amy Ayers, and she was actually the youngest. She was 13 years old, and she lived with her father, Bob Ayers, her mom, Pam Ayers, and her brother, Sean Ayers. And she was described as a very country girl who loved animals, loved farming. All of the girls actually were really interested in animals and farming, especially horses and lambs were most of these girls' favorite animals. And Amy actually took this a step further. She loved animals so much that her dream was actually to become a veterinarian so that she could help animals. And Bob, Amy's father, also described her as a daddy's girl. She really liked hanging out with her father, and they would work on the farm often together and, you know, tends to the animals, and she just absolutely loved doing that, and he loves doing it with her. She was attending Burnett Middle School at this time, which is the closest middle school to Lanier High School, and she was going to be going to Lanier High School when she turned 14, which would have been her freshman year. The fourth girl that we're going to be talking about is Eliza Thomas, and Eliza was actually working with Jennifer at the time at the yogurt shop that Jennifer had joined because she had to make payments for her car. The yogurt shop was called I Can't Believe It's Yogurt, and Eliza also started working there because she wanted some extra money, and just typical, you know, why every teen gets a job. They want extra money, they want freedom, they want all of that stuff. And she actually was the one to help Jennifer initially get the job at the yogurt shop because Eliza also went to Lanier High School and was involved in the welding and agricultural program. And all 4 girls knew each other because they were all involved in Lanier's Future Farmers of America chapter. And that's how they actually all met. Even Amy actually attended this club and these meetings, even though she technically was not in high school yet, but she was allowed to also join this club, and that's how everybody met each other. With all of that background, that brings us to December 6th, 1991. It was a Friday, and Eliza's shift started at 7 p.m. that night, and she was going to be closing with just Jennifer, and there was no one else that was scheduled to be working that night, and the yogurt shop did close at 11 p.m., so it was kind of a short shift. It was like 4 hours, maybe 5, depending on what time they actually ended up leaving the yogurt shop. And Sarah, Jennifer's sister, was hanging out with Amy at this time at North Cross Mall. And since it was Friday, they actually arranged for Amy to spend the night at Sarah and Jennifer's house so that they could all hang out because they didn't have school the next day. So after Sarah and Amy got kind of bored of the mall, they walked about 10 minutes to go to the yogurt shop where Jennifer and Eliza were working. It was just a few blocks away. And they were actually waiting at the yogurt shop for Jennifer to drive them both home. Since Amy was spending the night at their house, they just decided that Jennifer could drive both Sarah and Amy just back to the house. They mostly were just hanging out in the back, and Amy and Sarah, because they didn't want to disrupt the customers in the front. They didn't want, you know, anyone to feel awkward around them or anything like that, and they weren't trying to distract the girls, but they did actually help clean up a little bit just so that the girls could get out as soon as possible and they could get home. So towards the end of that night, as everything's getting ready to wind down and close, Jennifer started going out into the lobby area. She was cleaning tables, putting up chairs, you know, typical closing duties. And Eliza stayed behind the counter, sort of cleaning stuff up there, and if a few customers did come in for the last, you know, hour or so, she would be there to bring them up. Now, near closing time, a woman stopped by to pick up some frozen yogurt, and when she got into the shop, she said that there were only 2 other customers in the store at this time, and for whatever reason, she couldn't put her finger on it, but she said that they made her feel extremely uncomfortable. She just got a really bad vibe from them. And she said that they were 2 teenage boys that were facing each other at one of the tables. And what stood out is that they seemed to just be hanging out. They weren't eating yogurt. They weren't doing, you know, like schoolwork or anything like that. They seemed to just be kind of talking just to each other. And it didn't seem like they had previously purchased anything from the yogurt shop. She also noticed that there was some kind of small bag or sack laying between them, and they seemed to be really preoccupied with it, kind of moving it around with their foot, kind of messing with it. They seemed to really be aware that it was there. And from the angle that the woman was ordering the yogurt from, she could only really see one of the boys, who she described as having darker, tanner skin. She said that he was possibly Hispanic, but he could have also just been very tan. And this guy that she saw actually had his hand inside of the bag at one point and seemed to be sort of rolling something around. And to her, she just thought it was change or marbles, but he was definitely messing with something in the bag. And of course, the woman was a little concerned because there's these young girls who are working here, and if these are the only 2 customers, she didn't want them to feel put off. However, she said that the girls seemed perfectly fine, like they didn't even notice that the boys were there, and that they were just, you know, doing their job as usual. They didn't seem scared at all, so she just ignored it and wrote it off to her being crazy and just decided not to do anything. One of the last people to leave that night was a couple who said that one of the girls, presumably Jennifer, actually locked the door behind them as they were leaving because it was closing time. And it was already 10:47, so they kind of just assumed that the girls decided to, you know, just close the door so no new customers could come in and they could start doing their closing duties. The back door was still unlocked, and the front door was only locked from the inside, meaning people could still leave, but nobody could come in. The couple also mentioned that they saw 2 teenage boys sitting at a table across from each other as well, and they said that the booth that they were sitting at was closest to the cash register and farthest away from the door. So how it works is when you walk into the yogurt shop, you walk through the front doors, you see a bunch of tables and you see booths on the side, and then at the very front in front of you is the cash register, and it's kind of like a big counter at the front. So you walk a few steps, you know, to get to the cash register. So they were at this booth on the far left side that was really close to the cash register, but really far from the front doors. And the couple actually ended up, before leaving, sitting down to eat their yogurt inside of the restaurant. And the woman in the couple, obviously she has slight intuition, all women kind of do when it comes to true crime stuff. So she starts kind of looking at the boys a little bit, just kind of checking out what they're up to, you know. She also said that she got a weird feeling from them, a weird vibe, something was off. And she couldn't see both of the men, but the one who had their back turned to her, she said was wearing a tan jacket. And she said the other one looked pretty thin with light brown hair. Like I said, the couple ended up leaving around 10:47, and when they left, the only two people in the shop besides the girls who were working was these two men. And nobody truly knows what happened after 10:47 p.m. It's never been confirmed, and all we know is the aftermath of what happened. We do know that whatever happened likely happened around, or started happening around 11:03 p.m., which was pretty soon after the couple had left. And we know that at this time, Eliza pressed the no sale button on the cash register, which opens up the cash register to the cash drawer so that she could count it. And they did find later that around $500 was missing and taken from this register. So it was possibly a burglary situation where she was opening up the cash register and giving them everything that was in there. And we know that an hour later, detectives get a call to dispatch them to a yogurt shop that is on fire in Austin, Texas. And they also explain that there was a robbery and a homicide involved in this. I'll play the dispatch call for you right now.
Junkie?
Yeah.
You hear about the call 2900 West Anderson?
Yeah, I'm headed over there.
Okay.
I'll meet you out there. 2900. Go ahead, Wayne.
It's apparently a robbery homicide is 3 fatalities.
And at first, not the firefighters or the policemen thought that there was any foul play in this at all. They figured since it was a food place, someone probably just left an oven on. This happened from time to time, you know, small little fires can start and become big in food places when you are working with fire and flammable stuff around you. They had no idea what they were going to be walking into, because the girls ended up being tied up, gagged, shot, and then their bodies were all put in a pile on top of each other. Initially, they thought that there were only 3 victims, which would have been Jennifer, Eliza, and Sarah. However, Amy was actually found in a different part of the shop a little bit later, because after she was initially shot in the head, it missed her brain, and they believe that she tried to drag herself, to go get help or to escape, and then they shot her again in the head, and this shot was the one that killed her. So the girls' bodies, with the exception of Amy's, were found all laying on top of each other in kind of a pile, and they were all naked and bound, and they believe that then the store was set on fire. When the investigators got here and the detectives arrived to the scene, they said that this was one of the most disturbing scenes that they had ever stumbled across. And the investigators discovered that the 4 girls were gagged, and they were actually tied up with their own clothing and then shot. We do know that at least one of the girls was sexually assaulted, and the investigation was difficult, to say the least, because since the yogurt shop was set on fire, after the things happened to the girls, that destroyed a lot of potential evidence that they could have seen, and, fingerprints or anything like that. Also, since the firefighters didn't know that they were walking into a crime scene, they just thought it had been like an accidental fire that they would have been able to put out. They didn't put out the fire how they should have if they wanted to preserve the scene. So firefighters are able to do certain things to be able to preserve evidence if they know that there's going to be some kind of investigation, but they just had no idea that those girls were going to be in there. Now, they discovered from the gunshot wounds on the girls that 2 different kinds of guns would have had to been used, and that was a .380 caliber and a .22 caliber gun, and this led them to believe that there was 2 different killers at the scene who were both wielding different weapons. And they were actually able to find all of the rounds that had been used on the girls, but they didn't ever find the guns that were actually used. Amy's body was the only one that had the 2 bullet wounds on it, like I stated earlier. The rest of the girls just had the 1 shot, which presumably was fatal and instantly killed them. However, Amy obviously had the 2, and both her 2 wounds in her head were actually both from different guns as well. Amy also had a bruise right underneath her chin, which was evidence of being struck and probably strangled before she was shot. And they also found that the girls had actually done most of their nightly cleaning. When looking at everything, all of the napkin holders were full, all the chairs were put up, except for one. And this is where it gets really interesting. The one table that didn't appear to be cleaned up after, or, you know, the napkin holder wasn't full, the chairs weren't put up on top of it or anything like that, was the table closest to the register. And remember, this is the table that multiple witnesses said was being occupied by these 2 sort of sketchy teenage boys. Like I mentioned, the scene was just absolutely horrific to walk into. And investigators and firefighters said that even though they could distinguish the bodies, all of the girls were so badly burned that their bodies had started to melt into the floor. Amy's body was the least burned, presumably because she was by herself. And upon finding Amy's body, this is where they saw the first signs of sexual assault. The reason that they know this is because there was an ice cream scoop between her legs, and it was actually pointed up towards her pelvic bone. It is unclear to investigators if Amy was singled out and tortured in a way that the other girls weren't, or if they were all treated the same and Amy just happened to survive the first gunshot. They also were able to look at Amy's body more thoroughly, and there was just more evidence on her of what had happened to her versus the other girls who were obviously worsely burned, so you couldn't see as much evidence of the assaults that they may have gone through as well. When going in for autopsies, it's standard practice that the medical examiner swabs the bodies for accelerants. This always happens in arson cases, in cases involving fire. For some reason though, the medical examiner did not swab the bodies for accelerant in this case. To be quite honest, in a lot of ways, this crime scene was actually handled pretty poorly in general, considering the severity of the crimes that was taking place. Not everyone was wearing booties on the scene to protect evidence. The bathroom wasn't even dusted for fingerprints, and they didn't even keep the locks to see if they had been tampered with and if there was evidence of forced entry. And the reason they say that the crime scene was processed so sloppily was because this was the first serious crime that Austin, Texas had in a very long time. And in this time, in 1991, Austin was still considered a pretty small town. I know that when people mention Austin now, everybody knows where Austin, Texas is pretty much. Like it's a big city. But back then it was still considered a pretty small town. And the investigators and the crime scene collectors, none of them really knew what they were getting into when they were dispatched to this crime scene. And the investigators started obviously looking for suspects, and their list was huge of people that they suspected could have been doing this. It ended up being over 342 people on their list of suspects that they had to get through. So they started to narrow it down, get alibis, question people, and eventually they start to narrow it down to 4 boys. First, they looked at a boy named Maurice Pierce. He had gotten into trouble actually for carrying a .22 caliber gun in a mall just 8 days after the murders. And this obviously raised some red flags because that was one of the guns that was used in the yogurt shop murders. So they brought in the gun for analysis, but they were actually unable to match the guns, and it was found out that these were not the exact same guns that were used. However, as they were interviewing Maurice, he said that there were 3 other boys involved in this crime, and that he only knew about it because he drove the getaway car for them, but that he knows who did it. So he ends up accusing friends that were with him that day that they were the ones that took part in the murders. And these 3 boys are named Forrest Wellborn, Michael Scott, and Robert Springsteen IV. So Maurice claims that he had loaned the gun to Forrest, and that Forrest told him later what he did with it, like what he had done with the gun that he let him borrow. The suspects didn't end up lasting too long because they mic'd up Maurice and had him talk to Forrest so that they could get a confession. And he told Maurice just to talk to Forrest like he normally would, but bring up the murder so that they could possibly get a confession from Forrest. But Forrest had literally no idea what Maurice was talking about. Maurice tried to, you know, coerce him a little bit and be like, oh, remember when you did this? Wasn't that so bad? And then Forrest had genuinely no idea. It was clear he had no idea what he was talking about. They also brought in Michael and Robert just to see if maybe they could corroborate Maurice's story, and they also had no idea that that even happened, much less that they were involved in it. Forrest did say that the night in question he was hanging out with Maurice, Michael, and Robert at night, but they also did admit to stealing a car, but they said that they just drove it to San Antonio and they weren't even in Austin at the time. The investigators start to shift their attention after failing with these 4 boys. And after talking to witnesses who were at the yogurt shop that night, that they discovered that there was a man sitting in his car in front of the yogurt shop, and that he was there for a long time, just hanging out, and it almost seemed like he was maybe waiting for the girls to be getting out of work. So they wanted to find this guy, so they ended up drawing up a composite sketch based off of the witnesses' testimonies, and they released it to the public so that everybody could start looking for who this potential man might be. Not long after this, they were actually contacted by investigators in the sex crime unit who said that they had a sketch that looked just like the composite sketch that they had just released. I'll put them up now, and as you can see, they're scarily similar to one another. And it turns out that 3 weeks before the murders, a woman in Austin was actually kidnapped and sexually assaulted. And at the time, the investigators had released a sketch of 3 men wanted in connection with the crime. And one of them actually resembled the yogurt shop car guy extremely closely. So they ended up getting an anonymous tip that these kidnappers had fled to Mexico after committing this sexual assault on this woman. And authorities were able to catch 2 of them, and one of them does look extremely similar to the composite sketches. So this is where it starts to get even more complicated. So when American authorities went to go question the kidnappers in their connection with the yogurt shop murders, Mexican investigators said that they wanted to question them as well, which is kind of standard. A lot of times, crimes that took place in one country and are being solved in another country, both countries want to do their best investigation. So after the Mexican government questions them, they announced that the men had actually confessed to the murders and that they were going to be tried down in Mexico. However, the American authorities got to question the men about the crime also after their alleged confessions were given. And when the men were confessing to these crimes, the American authorities, they just didn't know any of the details of the crime. And they didn't even know the gun caliber that was used. And American investigators started to think that maybe the confessions were forced by the Mexican authorities. And after interviewing them more, the men actually ended up recanting their confessions, and they even went so far as to say that Mexican authorities had tortured them to get a confession out of them. And actually, this brings me to the fact that over the years, there was a total of 6 written confessions given to the police, and all of these were proven to not be true in one way or another. In 1999, so 8 years after the initial murders, the same 4 boys from earlier that we were just talking about were actually arrested again. So everyone was curious about what new evidence they could have found that connected these boys to this crime. And it turns out that there was nothing. There was no new evidence whatsoever. So they assumed that the 4 men had slipped out of their fingers the first time, and it must be them, and that they just hadn't questioned them properly or asked them the right things to connect them to this crime. One thing did go differently this time when they were questioning them, however, which is that they had 2 other confessions this time, and they were able to get them from 2 other boys, which were Michael Scott and Robert Springsteen. And Michael was the first to talk when, after being interrogated for a very long time, he said that they had only intended to perform a robbery and that he only pulled the trigger of the gun once, but that he kept hearing guns go off around him. Robert ended up corroborating the story and actually went further and said that he had shot one girl and raped her. And Robert, ever since then, has explained that he was so tired of being questioned at this time, so he just told them what they wanted to hear so that they would back off of him, which is kind of similar to my most recent case that we talked about with Stephanie Crow. Sometimes investigators will push people to the limit so far that although it seems outrageous to admit to a crime you didn't do, it actually does happen quite often. Forrest actually has never wavered in his innocence. He's never even admitted to a robbery or anything. The only thing that he ever admitted to was stealing the car that night, but he claims he was not even in Austin that night. Now, Michael and Robert, even though they did end up recanting their confessions by saying that they were coerced into making them, they were still taken to trial and they were tried separately. And even though the only evidence that the police had were these confessions that the boys had given, in 2001, Robert was actually found guilty and given the death penalty. And a year later, in 2002, Michael also got convicted. This time he was given a life sentence in prison. However, before either man fully got their sentence, both of their convictions actually got overturned in 2006 because constitutional violations were found in both confessions. So during the trial, both of the boys' taped confessions were used against one another. So in Robert's confession where he said that he worked with Michael for these murders, that was used in Michael's trial to prove him guilty and vice versa. And Michael's confession tape implicates Robert and Robert's confession tape implicates Michael. However, it is the law that at trials, the accused are allowed to confront their accusers, meaning that Michael should have been at Robert's trial and Robert should have been at Michael's trial. That is a constitutional right of trials. Since they didn't try them together, they had tried them separately, and they didn't allow either boy to be at each other's trials, this was a violation of court law. They weren't released quite yet though, actually, because there was a new DA, district attorney, named Rosemary Lemberg, who was determined to retry them. She just felt like it must have been them. There were some updates in 2009 for testing DNA where they can look specifically for just specific male DNA. And they had obtained DNA from the girls back in 1991 and tested it at the time. And then they retested it in 2009 with this new technology. And it was revealed that the DNA did not match any four of the boys, including the boy who had said that he had raped one of the girls, which would surely have left his DNA on her. And after 10 years of being in prison, Michael and Robert were released after there was not evidence to keep them in prison. They were not exonerated, and this was made very clear to them, which means they can be retried if new evidence were to come out about them. Now, I know this is getting confusing and complicated because there's so many moving parts, but there is actually another theory of what could happen. So we talked about the kidnappers who went to Mexico. That was one theory, and then obviously the four boys is the most popular theory that the investigators usually go for. And this is a third theory of what could have happened. As we know, on the night of the murders, there were two unidentified men who witnesses had seen, sitting in the yogurt shop at the booth by the cash register, and that they were whispering, quietly conversating, and investigators have tried to track down these men for many years, but to no avail. They've never found anybody who came close to the description. And in 2017, actually, an Australian investigator decided to use the DNA that they had from the crime scene and plug it in to see if there were any matches, and there actually was in this database that he looked. And the only problem with this match was that it had been submitted anonymously from the FBI, and it belonged to an offender, a criminal, or a detainee of some sort, but had no name attached to it. The FBI agreed to help the Austin Police Department, and they came up with more markers for the original strand of DNA that they had tested to see if it matched. However, when they did further testing on this piece of DNA, the DNA was not a complete match to that one in the system, in the FBI system. So after this lengthy investigation, Sonora, who was Eliza's sister, and she was actually 13 at the time, Amy's age, said that she had an extremely hard time dealing with her sister's death. Of course, all of the families did, but Sonora said that she had looked up to Eliza, and for a while after, she tried to convince herself that Eliza somehow escaped and they got it wrong, and that she was, you know, she'd be coming back home one day and that she was just off living a different life right now and staying hidden. Sonora also said that after this happened and after the initial investigation, that her parents never talked about Eliza again, never brought her up, and that the memories were just too painful for their family to even discuss. And Eliza really liked animals, like we talked about, and she actually had a pig that she planned on entering into a livestock show before her death, and Sonora actually ended up putting the pig in the fair for her honor. And in 1996, they actually ended up all moving. Eliza's family all ended up moving outside of Austin so that they weren't reminded of the same places and things that had happened to their daughter. And also during this time, Sonora says that she was really going towards a downward spiral, that she was in high school at this time, but that she had gotten heavily involved in drugs and alcohol, and she actually ended up even being sent to a school for troubled teenagers. She eventually was able to, I guess, come to terms with her sister's death, but I mean, how can you get over something that's so devastating and the fact that they don't even have answers is just awful. In 2010, Maurice Pierce, the boy that they were originally looking at, who led to all the other boys' arrests initially, actually ended up passing away after a police standoff, and an officer had stopped him for a traffic violation, and Maurice, for whatever reason, decided to stab him, and the officer actually survives this, but shot Maurice in the process, obviously in self-defense. And Maurice's family said that he had faced years of police harassment before this, and I don't know the validity of that, but that is how Maurice ended up passing away. So that brings us to today. Where are we in 2023? So Sonora, Eliza's sister, actually ended up becoming a therapist to help people like her who were experiencing trauma. So she helps people going through grief and hard times and trauma and all things like that, which I just think is awesome. And when Sonora actually got married, she had an empty chair for her sister and even mentioned her during the ceremony. And their mother, Marie Thomas, actually ended up passing away in 2015 without ever knowing what happens to her daughter. And Amy's brother, Sean, and his wife, Angie, actually still celebrate her birthday every year to honor her. And they'll usually bake a cake or get some kind of dessert just to celebrate her short life. Now, since this is still an unsolved case, it's really important that if you or anyone you know have any information whatsoever to help investigators, to call 512-472-TIPS. Some good that came from this case was that on August 3rd, 2022, so very recently, the Homicide Victims Family Rights Act was signed into law, which was inspired by the yogurt shop murders, actually. And this law provides family members of cold case murder victims a way to officially request federal investigators to review their case with the newest and updated technology. So even if your case is cold, with the new updates that are always happening in true crime and in investigating crime scenes, basically they're allowed to request that their case gets looked at again in case there are any new updates or leads that could be found based on the new technology. Now, today there is different businesses occupying where the yogurt shop once was, and there is a memorial plaque in the parking lot of this little strip center that is dedicated to the girls, and it has an inscription across it that reads, "Forever in our hearts," and all 4 girls' names are written right underneath it. So yeah, that is kind of that's the yogurt shop murders, you know? Like I said, it's just so crazy. I mean, such a gruesome and horrific crime, and just to not have any leads whatsoever. It's just so crazy. I feel so bad for the families of the girls and for the girls themselves. That must have been such a terrifying experience. And the fact that it ended their lives is just so horrific. But let me know what you guys think of this case. Let me know if you've heard of it before, because I definitely had not, but I got really interested in it once I, started reading about it and stuff. It's just so crazy. But I hope that you guys enjoyed this video, and like I said, if you did, please give it a thumbs up, and I will see you guys in the next true crime case, where I will be discussing the new series that we will be going through. So bye guys.